The Wehrmacht smashed through the Ardennes forest on 10th of May 1940, and within a fortnight the entire Allied defensive strategy lay in ruins. What military planners in Paris and London had spent months constructing the careful positioning of the British Expeditionary Force, the coordination with French armies, the assumption that the Maginot Line would hold, all of it collapsed in a matter of days. German panzer divisions didn't just breach the front. They raced through gaps so quickly that Allied commanders were reading battlefield reports that were already 12 hours out of date. By 20th May, German armored columns had reached the Channel coast at Abbeville, effectively cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and 3 French armies from the rest of France. 300,000 British and French troops found themselves trapped in an ever-shrinking pocket around the port of Dunkirk. The military term for their situation was encircled. The blunt reality was that Britain's entire professional army, the core of its military strength, was about to be captured or annihilated. Rimac generals were already discussing which units would march in the victory parade through London. The question wasn't whether Britain could be defeated, but how quickly they'd accept the inevitable. Field Marshal Wilhelm Cattel examined reports of the Dunkirk pocket and told colleagues that the British situation was hopeless in a military sense. He wasn't engaging in propaganda. He was reading topographical maps and counting divisions. Operation Dynamo, the emergency evacuation from Dunkirk, began on 26th of May, 1940. What unfolded over the next 9 days became one of history's most remarkable retreats, though calling it a victory required extraordinary spin. Yes, 338-26 men made it off those beaches, but they left behind virtually all their heavy equipment. 600 tanks, 2,500 artillery pieces, 64,000 vehicles, and mountains of ammunition and supplies. Britain had saved its men, but lost its army's teeth. Churchill himself told the War Cabinet on 28th of May that Britain now possessed perhaps a dozen properly equipped divisions to defend the entire island against an invasion force that had just torn through the supposedly impregnable French defenses. The Royal Navy remained formidable and the RAF was intact. But if German boots hit British soil in force, there was precious little standing between them and Whitehall. The French situation deteriorated even faster. Paris fell on 14th of June 1940. By 22nd June, Marshal Pétain was signing an armistice in the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler's deliberate theater of revenge. Britain now stood entirely alone. Every other Western European democracy had either fallen or remained neutral. The Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact with Hitler. America sat across the Atlantic, firmly isolationist. In Berlin, the mood was almost celebratory. Hitler's architect, Albert Speer, later recalled the Führer poring over architectural plans for remodeling Berlin into the world capital German mania, convinced the war in the West was essentially finished. German military intelligence assessed that Britain, deprived of continental allies and facing the full weight of Wehrmacht, would seek terms within weeks. It wasn't arrogance. From a purely military standpoint, their analysis seemed sound. The Luftwaffe had proven itself unstoppable in Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. Its commanders believed one sustained bombing campaign against British ports and airfields would demonstrate to London's leadership that continued resistance meant nothing but destruction without purpose. Surely Churchill, however bombastic his rhetoric, would eventually bow to mathematics. They were about to discover that mathematics doesn't account for everything. Hitler's expectation of British surrender wasn't wishful thinking. It was based on what he considered a rational assessment of Britain's options. On 2 July 1940, he issued a directive to his commanders preparing for the possibility of an invasion. But the document's language revealed his true belief. He expected Britain to see reason before such measures became necessary. The Führer had watched other European leaders choose pragmatism over destruction, and he saw no reason why the British would be different. His track record supported this confidence. Austria's Kurt Schuschnigg had capitulated without a shot in March 1938. Czechoslovakia's Emil Hatcher had signed his country away after a single night of intimidation. Poland fought, but even that campaign ended in weeks. In Hitler's mind, leaders, when confronted with overwhelming force, made rational calculations about national survival. Churchill, he reasoned, would eventually perform the same arithmetic. The terms Hitler envisioned offering Britain were, by his standards, generous. Germany would dominate the continent. Britain would keep its empire and navy. The Reich wanted continental hegemony, not British colonies in Africa and Asia. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop had actually laid out these parameters in private discussions, suggesting that Britain could remain a global power if it simply accepted German supremacy in Europe. From Berlin's perspective, this seemed almost magnanimous. Britain would lose nothing it currently possessed overseas, merely acknowledge the new European reality. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel told interrogators after the war that Hitler genuinely admired the British Empire and had no desire to dismantle it. The Führer saw Britain and Germany as natural allies against Bolshevism. His book Mein Kampf, despite its many hatreds, expressed respect for British imperial administration. Hitler believed he was offering Churchill a face-saving exit. Stop fighting over Poland, already defeated, and keep everything else that matters to you. German military intelligence reinforced this expectation. Their reports suggested that Churchill represented a war party that was growing more isolated daily. The ABV, Germany's military intelligence service, intercepted communications indicating substantial British elite support for negotiations. These weren't fabrications. There genuinely were voices in London's corridors of power advocating precisely what Hitler expected. The intelligence wasn't wrong. The conclusion drawn from it was, General Franz Halder, the Wehrmacht's chief of general staff, wrote in his diary on 13th of July that Britain's military situation was hopeless, and that Churchill's government would likely fall once the British public grasped the full extent of their predicament. Halder was no fool. He'd orchestrated the stunning victory in France. His assessment that Britain couldn't win militarily was accurate. What he missed was that not winning and not surrendering aren't the same thing. Hitler kept delaying the formal planning for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, because he was waiting for London to initiate contact about terms. He told General Alfred Jodl in mid-June that he didn't want to humiliate Britain unnecessarily, as he'd need them as future partners against the Soviet Union. Every day that passed without an invasion being launched was in Hitler's mind another opportunity for Churchill to come to his senses. The Luftwaffe's Hermann Göring shared this assessment but with less patience. He believed a demonstration of air power hitting military targets disrupting supply chains, showing Britain's vulnerability, would accelerate the political calculation. Göring wasn't advocating for the terror bombing of civilians at this stage. He was planning what he considered a rational application of military pressure to achieve a political objective. What none of them grasped was that Churchill wasn't playing the same game. They expected a European-style negotiation between rational state actors. Churchill was preparing for something far more elemental, while Hitler was waiting for British reason to prevail. That very reason was being argued for inside Churchill's own war cabinet. Between 26th and 28th of May 1940, Reiter's Dunkirk evacuation ships were dodging Luftwaffe bombs. The most consequential debate in British history was unfolding in the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, wasn't some defeatist or coward. He was an experienced diplomat who'd served as Viceroy of India, and he was making what he considered a coldly logical case. Halifax's proposal was specific. Approach Mussolini as a mediator to explore what terms might be available from Germany. Italy hadn't yet entered the war, and Mussolini still fancied himself a statesman, rather than Hitler's junior partner. Halifax argued that if reasonably acceptable terms existed, keeping the fleet, maintaining independence, preserving the empire, rejecting them out of pride, would be criminal negligence. Better to discover what was on offer than to fight to total destruction without even knowing if an alternative existed. The Foreign Secretary put it bluntly in the 26th May meeting. We had to face the fact that it was not so much a question of imposing a complete defeat upon Germany, but of safeguarding the independence of our own empire. He wasn't arguing for surrender. He was arguing for diplomatic exploration before the military situation deteriorated further. If Britain waited until after losing its entire army and air force, it would negotiate from an even weaker position. Neville Chamberlain, still in the War Cabinet despite his May resignation as Prime Minister, initially leaned towards Halifax's position. This wasn't appeasement nostalgia. Chamberlain had spent the past year building up Britain's military after Munich's failure, but he'd also seen the Wehrmacht's capabilities up close, and the mathematics troubled him. 3 of the War Cabinet's 5 members were at least open to Halifax exploration. Churchill faced a genuine constitutional crisis. He'd been Prime Minister for barely 2 weeks. Halifax had deeper Conservative Party roots and broader support amongst the establishment. If Churchill forced a confidence vote on the peace question and lost, Halifax would likely become Prime Minister, and Britain's course would shift dramatically. The new Prime Minister wasn't just fighting Hitler. He was fighting his own government. The debate crescendoed on 28th of May. Halifax pressed his case with increasing frustration, arguing that Churchill's refusal to even explore terms was emotional rather than rational. The Foreign Secretary said Britain must be ready to consider dissent terms if such were offered to us. Churchill countered that any negotiation process would destroy British morale, and that Hitler's terms would reduce Britain to a slave state regardless of the paper promises. Then Churchill did something decisive. He called a meeting of the full Outer Cabinet, the 25 ministers outside the core War Cabinet. In that larger room, he laid out the choices starkly. He told them that nations which went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished. He painted the picture of negotiation itself as a trap. Once you entered talks, you were signaling weakness, and Hitler would tighten the screws until Britain accepted vassalage disguised as peace. The Outer Cabinet erupted in support. Ministers banged the table, shouted approval, and made clear they'd rather fight. Churchill had bypassed Halifax's careful logic with something more powerful. He'd connected with the emotional truth that compromise with Hitler meant extinction by degrees. When the War Cabinet reconvened, Halifax's proposal was effectively dead. He'd been outmaneuvered politically, and he knew it. Churchill had won the room, but he hadn't yet won the country. That would require something more than a closed-door political victory. It would require him to speak directly to the British people and articulate why fighting mattered more than survival. Churchill rose to address the House of Commons on 4th of June 1940, the day after the last ships limped back from Dunkirk. Everyone in that chamber knew the brutal facts. The evacuation had saved men, but abandoned an army's worth of equipment on French beaches. The question hanging in the air was whether the Prime Minister would prepare the nation for capitulation or something else entirely. He began with unflinching honesty about the military disaster. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory, he told the packed chamber. Wars are not won by evacuations. Churchill wasn't interested in sugarcoating Dunkirk. He walked through the numbers, the losses, the equipment left behind. He made Parliament confront the scope of the defeat before he offered them anything resembling hope. Then he shifted. He started building a case not for why Britain could win, but for why Britain must fight regardless. He described the Wehrmacht's capabilities without flinching, their tanks, their aircraft, their proven tactics. And then he laid out in methodical detail how Britain would resist invasion. We shall defend our island. Whatever the cost may be, not might defend, shall defend. What came next was a crescendo that every person in that chamber felt in their chest. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. Each phrase hit like a hammer. No conditional language, no diplomatic hedging, just the blunt promise of endless resistance. Harold Nicholson, a National Labour MP, recorded in his diary that evening that the House was deeply moved, but that many MPs had tears streaming down their faces during the speech. This wasn't theatrical emotion. It was the release of tension that had been building since Dunkirk. Churchill had given them permission to feel what they'd been suppressing, that fighting mattered more than the odds. Then came the line that would echo through history. We shall never surrender. But Churchill didn't stop there. He added something that revealed his strategic mind. Even if Britain itself were conquered, he declared, the empire and the fleet would continue the struggle, until, in God's good time, the new world with all its power and might steps forth to the rescue and liberation of the old. That final clause was deliberate messaging. Churchill was telling America and telling Hitler that this war wouldn't end with Britain's fall. He was threatening infinite resistance, a forever war that would eventually drag in American industrial might. It was a bluff, perhaps, but it was a bluff delivered with such conviction that it sounded like prophecy. The speech's structure was masterful. Churchill had opened by acknowledging disaster, which gave him credibility to then reframe that disaster as the beginning of resistance, rather than the end of hope. He'd taken the worst military defeat in modern British history and transformed it into a launching point for defiance MPs, who'd entered the chamber wondering whether negotiation might be sensible, left it, convinced that surrender was unthinkable. The BBC broadcast portions of the speech that evening. Though Churchill didn't deliver it himself on radio, an actor read excerpts for the broadcast. But the word spread regardless, reprinted in every newspaper, discussed in every pub. Factory workers quoted it. Soldiers repeated it. The speech became the articulation of something the British public had been feeling but couldn't quite express. German intelligence intercepts caught the speech and translations landed on desks in Berlin within hours. The reaction there was confusion more than concern. Hitler's analysts noted the rhetoric, but dismissed it as the posturing of a leader trying to rally a defeated nation. They still expected reality to set in once the Luftwaffe began its campaign in earnest. They'd fundamentally misunderstood what Churchill had just accomplished. The speech didn't just inspire, it fundamentally altered how millions of Britons processed their situation. Within 48 hours of Churchill's Commons address, Mass Observation, a social research organization that documented everyday British life, recorded a striking shift in the conversations happening in shops, factories, and homes across the country. Where previous weeks had been filled with anxious speculation about peace terms, the dominant theme now was practical preparation for assistance. Women's voluntary service enrollment stations reported a 40% surge in applications in the week following 4th of June. These weren't symbolic gestures. Volunteers were signing up for practical roles, driving ambulances, manning observation posts, organizing evacuations. The speech had given people a framework for understanding their fear. Instead of being paralyzed by the threat of invasion, they now had a mental model. Invasion was survivable if everyone contributed to resistance. Factory production data from the Ministry of Supply showed something remarkable. In late May, absenteeism at munitions factories had been climbing as workers heard rumors about peace negotiations and questioned whether their labor mattered. After Churchill's speech, absenteeism dropped by nearly a third within 2 weeks. Workers at the Supermarine factory in Southampton, which produced Spitfires, began voluntarily extending their shifts. One foreman told a home intelligence report that men were saying, "Hitler needs to see what we can build before he gets here." The psychological mechanism at work was what modern researchers would call collective efficacy, the belief that group action can achieve meaningful results. Churchill hadn't promised victory. He'd promised that resistance itself had value. That subtle distinction mattered enormously. People could commit to fighting without needing to believe they'd win, as long as they believed fighting served a purpose beyond mere survival. RF squadron morale shifted perceptibly. Pilots who'd spent Dunkirk week flying exhausting sorties over France, watching the Army retreat, had begun questioning whether they were merely postponing the inevitable. Flight Lieutenant Brian Lane of 19th Squadron wrote in his diary on 3rd of June that the squadron mess had been bloody grim with pilots wondering, what's the point? By 6th of June, his diary entry noted that the mood had turned a corner, and men were talking about kill ratios we'd need to make invasion impossible. The local defense volunteers, later renamed the Home Guard, saw recruitment explode. By mid-June, 1.5 million men had enrolled, many of them veterans of the Great War, who were beyond military age. They drilled with shotguns, improvised pikes, and whatever weapons they could acquire. Objectively, they'd have been slaughtered by Wehrmacht regulars. But Churchill's speech had given them a role in the narrative. Even last resistance had dignity and purpose. Churches reported increased attendance in June 1940, with vicars noting that congregations seemed to be seeking communal reinforcement of resolve rather than just spiritual comfort. A vicar in Kent told the Bishop of Canterbury that his Sunday service on 9th of June felt less like worship and more like a town meeting where we were all agreeing to see this through together. The speech's impact on children revealed how thoroughly it had penetrated British consciousness. Schools reported students playing invasion games where they practiced the scenarios Churchill had described, fighting on beaches, in streets, in hills. Teachers initially worried this was unhealthy, but child psychologists at the time noted that the play actually reduced anxiety by making the threat feel manageable. Children were rehearsing resistance, not paralyzed by fear. Even skeptical voices found themselves pulled along. George Orwell, hardly a Churchill admirer, wrote in his diary on 8th of June that he'd found himself believing that we might actually hold them off, despite thinking Churchill's rhetoric was half nonsense the week before. The speech had created a permission structure for hope. What German intelligence missed was that Churchill hadn't just made a speech, he'd provided a psychological architecture that let an entire nation reframe catastrophe as the opening chapter of resistance rather than the final chapter of defeat. Luftwaffe. Reconnaissance flights over southern England in July 1940 were returning with photographs that didn't match German intelligence predictions. Analysts at Oberkommando der Luftwaffe headquarters expected to see a nation bracing for surrender negotiations, reduced port activity, military units standing down, civilian evacuation of coastal areas. Instead, they photographed the opposite: defensive positions being reinforced, beach obstacles being constructed, and civilian populations staying put rather than fleeing inland. Göring's intelligence staff had developed a timeline. They estimated that 2 weeks of concentrated Luftwaffe attacks on RAF airfields and aircraft factories would establish air superiority. Another 2 weeks of bombing ports and supply infrastructure would demonstrate British vulnerability. By mid-August, they projected the cumulative psychological pressure combined with military reality would trigger political collapse in London. Churchill would be replaced by someone reasonable, probably Halifax, and terms would follow naturally. The Adler-Eagle Day offensive began on 13th of August 1940. Luftwaffe bombers hit radar stations, airfields, and aircraft production facilities. German pilots reported successful strikes and bomb damage assessments confirmed hits on target. But what they didn't see in their reconnaissance footage was panic. RAF squadrons kept scrambling. Factory workers kept showing up. The predicted psychological collapse simply wasn't happening. ABAR agents operating in Britain, the few who hadn't been caught and turned by MI5's double-cross system, sent back reports that contradicted Berlin's expectations. One agent's message in mid-August noted that London newspapers weren't calling for peace negotiations, but rather printing tutorials on identifying German aircraft types. Another reported that civilians in Southampton, after a raid destroyed part of the city center, had organized bucket brigades and were rebuilding rather than demanding their government sue for peace. German signals intelligence intercepted British communications and found something baffling. RAF pilots' radio chatter remained aggressive and confident, even as squadron losses mounted. The Luftwaffe's psychological warfare experts had predicted that British pilot morale would crack once they realized they were outnumbered. Instead, intercepts caught pilots joking about kill ratios and volunteering for extra sorties. One intercepted transmission from a RAF squadron leader responding to a pilot requesting leave allegedly said, "You can rest when Hitler does." Göring's staff began adjusting their timeline. Perhaps 3 weeks of attacks rather than 2, perhaps a month. The Reichsmarschall blamed his field commanders for insufficient aggression. He ordered the Luftwaffe to expand targeting to include London itself, believing that bombing the capital would finally break civilian morale and force Churchill's hand. The first major raid on London came on 7th of September 1940, the beginning of the Blitz. The German logic seemed sound. Medieval cities had surrendered when besieged and starved. Modern populations would surely be less resilient when faced with high explosives and incendiaries. But what Göring's planners hadn't accounted for was that Churchill's speech had already done its work. British civilians had been mentally prepared for this exact scenario. When the bombs fell, they weren't surprised. They'd been told this was coming, and they'd been told they would endure it. Home intelligence reports from September 1940 showed something that would have shocked German intelligence analysts. In heavily bombed areas, support for continuing the war actually increased rather than decreased. Londoners who'd been vaguely in favor of fighting became absolutely committed once their own streets were hit. The bombing didn't break resolve. It personalized the conflict. Hitler wasn't an abstract threat anymore. He just destroyed your neighbor's house. Göring told Hitler on 15th of September that the Luftwaffe needed more time, that British resistance was proving temporarily stubborn. That word temporarily revealed the continuing German assumption that British morale would eventually crack. They kept waiting for the collapse that military logic demanded. It never came. RAF Fighter Command was hemorrhaging pilots faster than training schools could replace them. By early September 1940, some squadrons were operating at 60% strength. Pilots were flying 4, sometimes 5 sorties per day, climbing into cockpits still warm from the previous pilot's body heat. The mathematics were brutal. The Luftwaffe could afford losses that would annihilate the RAF. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowing calculated that, at current attrition rates, Fighter Command would cease to exist as an effective force by mid-October. Yet pilots kept climbing back into their Hurricanes and Spitfires. Squadron leader Tom Gleave, who suffered horrific burns when his Hurricane was shot down on 31st August, told a nurse whilst recovering that returning to combat wasn't even a question. Churchill said, "We fight in the air, so that's what we do." This wasn't blind obedience. It was the internalization of a framework that made suicidal odds seem purposeful rather than pointless. The speech's specific phrases became verbal shorthand in RAF messes. When pilots were exhausted, when losses mounted, when replacement aircraft arrived slower than combat damaged them, someone would mutter, "We shall never surrender." And it functioned as a reset button. Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Wellham, then 19 years old and flying with 92 Squadron, later recalled that Churchill's words gave us permission to be terrified, but keep going anyway. German intelligence kept extending their victory timeline. In late August, Wehrmacht planners told Hitler that Britain would collapse by mid-September. When mid-September arrived with the RAF still contesting every raid, the estimate shifted to early October. On 15th of September, later commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe launched its largest daylight operation, throwing everything at London in an attempt to force the decisive break. They lost 60 aircraft that day. The RAF lost 26 fighters, but most pilots survived. More critically, the Luftwaffe's bomber formations were so badly mauled that German crews began questioning whether daylight operations over Britain were sustainable. The RAF wasn't supposed to still have this many fighters. Intelligence had assured them that Fighter Command was on its last legs. Yet here were British squadrons rising to meet them again and again. What German analysts couldn't see from their aerial photographs was what happened in the minutes before pilots scrambled. Squadron commanders didn't need to give elaborate pep talks. The shared framework Churchill had established meant everyone already understood the assignment. When the scramble order came, pilots ran to their aircraft, knowing that even if this sortie killed them, they were fulfilling the exact role Churchill had described, making invasion impossible by contesting every mile of British airspace. The Luftwaffe's shift to night bombing in mid-October was a tacit admission of daylight failure. Göring couldn't say this explicitly to Hitler, so here framed it as a strategic choice. Terror bombing would break civilian morale where military targeting hadn't, but RAF pilots understood what it actually meant. The Luftwaffe could no longer safely operate in daylight over Britain. They'd won air superiority, not through numerical advantage, but by refusing to break when breaking was the rational choice. Hitler formally postponed Operation Celion on 17th of September, though he kept the invasion threat active for months to maintain pressure. The postponement wasn't driven by weather concerns or naval inadequacy. It was driven by the Luftwaffe's inability to deliver what Göring had promised. German staff officers had calculated that invasion required complete air dominance. The RAF's continued existence made invasion a potential catastrophe. Churchill's speech hadn't changed the technical balance of forces. It had changed the calculus of endurance. German planning assumed British resolve had a breaking point that military pressure would reach. What they encountered instead was a force that had already decided breaking wasn't an option, regardless of cost. The Luftwaffe's failure to predict British resilience wasn't an intelligence mistake. It was a conceptual impossibility built into German military culture itself. Wehrmacht officers had been trained in a tradition where leadership flowed from authority, competence, and the ability to deliver victory. The idea that a leader could inspire sustained resistance through rhetoric alone, especially after catastrophic military defeat, simply didn't compute within their framework of how power functioned. German military analysis of Churchill treated him as they would treat one of their own leaders, a man whose political survival depended on delivering tangible results. When Churchill failed to prevent the fall of France, failed to save the BEF's equipment, failed to keep Britain's continental foothold, German analysts kept expecting his government to collapse. In their system, a leader who presided over such disasters would be replaced. That Churchill's position actually strengthened after Dunkirk appeared to German observers as evidence of British political irrationality rather than what it actually was: democratic leadership, operating on different principles. Ober-Ulrich Liss, head of German Army Intelligence's Western Section, later admitted to interrogators that German intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood the British political system. They'd assumed Churchill was like Hitler, dependent on maintaining an image of infallibility and success. They couldn't grasp that democratic leaders could acknowledge failure, even lead the nation through catastrophe, and remain in power if they articulated a convincing path forward. Churchill's honesty about Dunkirk being a defeat, not a victory, would have destroyed a German leader's credibility. It enhanced Churchill's. The cultural gap extended deeper. German military culture prized efficiency, rational calculation, and acceptance of reality. When Napoleon faced impossible odds in 1815, he fought at Waterloo and lost definitively. When the German Empire faced certain defeat in 1918, it sued for peace. The pattern was clear. Civilized nations recognized when they were beaten and negotiated. Accordingly, Britain's refusal to follow this pattern appeared to German analysts as stubborn irrationality rather than calculated strategy. What they missed was the difference between Prussian military honor, which emphasized knowing when you were defeated, and British cultural memory, which celebrated defeats like the charge of the Light Brigade, precisely because futile courage had its own value. German officers saw military analysis as mathematics. British culture saw certain kinds of resistance as transcending mere calculation. Churchill hadn't invented this. He'd activated something already. Present in British historical consciousness, the Luftwaffe's psychological warfare strategy assumed that demonstrating military superiority would trigger political pressure on Churchill from a rational population. They'd seen this work elsewhere. Warsaw surrendered after the Luftwaffe reduced parts of Thessaly to rubble. Rotterdam capitulated after one devastating raid. But these were cities facing imminent ground assault with no hope of relief. Britain was an island with a navy facing an invasion that might never come. Led by Eamon, who'd explicitly told them suffering had purpose, German planners also misread British class dynamics. They assumed the aristocracy and business classes would pressure Churchill to negotiate once profits were threatened. Some did. Halifax represented this faction, but Churchill had outmaneuvered them in May. German intelligence kept waiting for this pressure to resurface, not understanding that the speech had fundamentally shifted what was politically acceptable to advocate. After never surrender entered the national vocabulary, openly calling for peace negotiations became nearly impossible without appearing treasonous. The final miscalculation was strategic. Germany had won continental Europe through lightning campaigns that broke enemy morale before attrition became relevant. Their entire military doctrine was built around decisive victories. That made continued resistance pointless. They'd never faced an opponent who decided. Beforehand, that pointless resistance was exactly the point. Churchill had taken Germany's greatest strategic weapon, their ability to make fighting seem futile, and neutralized it with words before the battle even began.